Trump on the basis of substantive policy decisions that he's made, betrayals that are obvious and quantifiable. And you will get people in your face saying, how dare you attack the president? Are you serious? That guy works for me. That guy works for you.
Yeah, listen up, bitch.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
I'm sorry. No, your opinion matters. My opinion matters. Every American's opinion matters. We should be heard. We should be respected. And no way am I going to be kowtowed and not saying the obvious, which is this guy has failed in his responsibility. He is disdainful towards the American people. He's disdainful.
This conversation is not about a casual voter changing his mind. It is about someone who saw Trump as a necessary correction to a cultural and political order he believed was failing the country. Someone close enough to help shape the message, and someone who later concluded that the presidency had not met the responsibility it claimed. To understand the break, you first have to understand why the belief was so strong, why it survived scandal, and why disappointment arrived later than outsiders assumed. This is Synthesize, where we turn long podcast conversations into their most important ideas. Before the break, there was a coherent case for support. In the guest's telling, the attraction was not mainly Trump's temperament. It was the unusual clarity of the message. While conventional politicians sounded managed and evasive, Trump kept returning to a few blunt themes that felt stable, legible, and already familiar to people who believed the country had drifted too far from common sense. That distinction matters, because it explains why many supporters thought critics were reacting to style while missing the substance.
Washington had been up until the moment Trump came on the scene.
Right.
And Trump was very, if not articulate, he had baseline messages that were unassailable and that he repeated with great repetition, and the things that he espoused and talked about endlessly were things that I believed in and things that most Americans, when they actually took the time to separate Trump's policies from Trump the man, were super attractive. And it was such a departure from what we'd seen from every other elected official.
This preserves the documentary's essential starting point. Support did not begin as a cult of personality. It began with a separation. Policy from man, message from manner. That separation made later disappointment possible, because the original loyalty was conditional in theory, even if it became durable in practice. The appeal went deeper than campaign language. It carried an emotional claim about the country itself. Trump is remembered here not as the agent of disruption, celebrated by supporters and feared by opponents, but as a vehicle for return, a way back to something the guest felt had been visibly lost. Border politics, civic order, and national identity fused into a single intuition. America was degrading, and Trump named that degradation in plain terms.
Republican leaders, and they were denied it every time. And Trump came in and said, look, there's an end to that. This is unacceptable. We've failed over the past 30 years. I've seen it up close and personal. Just aside from all of his obvious foibles and his disgusting elements of his personality, he was, it seemed, someone who had been steeped. He built things. And very few people built things by the time Trump came along. We were not a manufacturing society at that point. And even if I didn't like his gilded name on all sorts of properties, he had employed a ton of people.
This chapter preserves the emotional substrate beneath the politics. The T word is not upheaval, but normalcy. That helps explain why support could feel moral rather than merely partisan. It was tied to memory, order, and the repair of a world believed to be unraveling. By 2016, that sense of decline had hardened into urgency. Support was no longer framed as preference among candidates. It was framed as necessity. The guest describes an atmosphere in which cultural despair, demographic fear, and resentment toward the Obama years made compromise feel impossible. In that frame, Trump's flaws did not disappear. They were subordinated to a larger belief that this was the last available off-ramp.
For years, they would say, this is the existential election. Like, this is the election that really is going to determine the path we're on. And by the time 16 came around, it really seemed, with the hangover and the depressing anti-American, anti-white, the Obama program was so dispiriting to witness, and the wreckage I felt socially, that this was the existential election in 16. I felt that strongly. So Trump was the only one. Everybody else, I mean, Jeb Bush's program, I couldn't even tell you what.
This is where the stakes escalate. If an election feels existential, support becomes more tolerant of contradiction. People accept costs they would otherwise reject because the alternative seems final. That logic helps explain why the bond proved resilient under pressure. The argument was not only intellectual, it was lived from the inside. The guest was not describing an outsider's impression of the campaign, but the feeling of working within it and finding almost no friction between the language he was writing and his own convictions. That kind of alignment matters in a documentary like this because it raises the witness standard. The later critic is credible precisely because the earlier advocate was sincere.
That's amazing. I didn't even know you were doing that.
I had a lot of freedom to do. That was the other thing, the stuff that I delivered. Had a lot of freedom to, had a lot of license. I felt like I was writing from my own perspective, and that's how aligned I was with what Trump had articulated. It was like some of the easiest speeches to write because they were on.
The point here is not biography for its own sake. It is evidentiary. The closer the alignment once was, the harder it is to dismiss the eventual break as opportunism or distance. The film gains authority by showing that the criticism comes from prior commitment, not prior hostility. Then came the idealized statement of purpose. In the guest's memory, Trump's inaugural message distilled the entire attraction into one audaciously simple principle. Elected officials are supposed to serve the nation they govern. What struck him was not just the content, but the rarity of hearing it said so directly. This became the standard against which the presidency would later be judged.
So seriously, it was during Trump's inauguration speech the first time. And if you read that speech, as I did, it's like, this is unimpeachable. This is not controversial. These things that he is saying is such a breath of fresh air that no man in American politics has ever had the balls to say. Why is that? Like, how is it that we are in a country now where it's embarrassing to say that the reason you have elected officials is so they can take care of America and Americans? To this day,
This is the documentary's measuring rod. The later sense of failure is not random disillusionment. It is failure relative to a clearly stated governing ethic. Promise and betrayal only make sense if the promise is sharp. Support also became part of identity. The guest describes public support in a hostile city not just as a political position, but as a test of nerve. This is where belief hardens. Once a stance becomes proof of character, criticism from outside can strengthen commitment rather than weaken it. The politics turn social, then moral, then personal.
It doesn't make people's behavior better at all. But you decide when you know that 96% of the people in your city disagree with you to let them know what you think.
that's what it means to be an American man.
The documentary needs this moment of vulnerability because it shows the cost of support. It was not only agreement with a platform. It involved risking status, friction, and isolation. That helps explain why later reversal would also require a public cost. That identity helps explain one of the documentary's central paradoxes. The moments many outsiders assumed would destroy Trump often reinforced belief instead. A scandal did not simply test character. It tested endurance. And when Trump remained standing, some supporters interpreted survival itself as evidence that his motives were larger than vanity. The more punishment he absorbed, the more serious the mission seemed.
Two authors, men and women.
Yeah.
Is it fair?
Yes. Oh, completely. And also it demonstrated how committed he was, because he should have been. If there was ever a time you should be overwhelmed by shame, it was that, saying that in public. I mean, it was pretty gross and embarrassing and shocking. But the fact that he actually debated Hillary the next day and did a great job allowed me to believe that this was not about his personal ambition. This was a guy who actually cared about America. He's willing to subject himself.
This preserves a crucial mechanism of prolonged loyalty. Scandal was reinterpreted not as disqualifying evidence, but as proof of commitment under fire. Once that pattern takes hold, disillusionment becomes much harder, because contradiction is absorbed into the story rather than breaking it. But loyalty built on an outsider promise can be damaged by insider behavior. The guest identifies the early administration's staffing and power structure as the first serious rupture. Not because politics is pure, but because the campaign had implied a different kind of presidency. If the mission was to challenge the machinery, then reproducing its logic from inside looked less like strategic compromise and more like reversion.
So early on, Trump didn't take that seriously. One thing that made him super attractive was he was an outside candidate. He wasn't a politician. He was a businessman, and he was there for a very specific purpose. And yet he came in and not only didn't understand how Washington works, he didn't take the appropriate measures to protect himself and his agenda. Instead, he reverted to type and, hired a bunch of Goldman Sachs people and billionaires and empowered his son-in-law, who'd been a Democrat until the day before.
This is the real turning point. The problem is no longer media hostility or elite opposition. It is internal contradiction. The presidency begins to look less like an assault on the system than an accommodation to familiar power. And that is much harder for a committed supporter to explain away. From there, the conversation widens. The guest stops treating failure as only one man's failure and points to a deeper engine of political life: status conflict. Prestige, rank, resentment, and insecurity do not just color politics. They can shape policy itself. This is an important late reframing, because it suggests that what looked like ideological battle was often driven by human appetites operating beneath the stated arguments.
Oh, what actually happened.
Yes. Preserve the truth.
Preserve the truth. That's preserve the truth. So I just want this to be a record of the truth, and that, status anxiety, which is a huge driver of human behavior, is it not?
Yes.
It's a huge driver of President Trump's behavior, huge driver of his behavior, plays a role in all this stuff. These unannounced conflicts between groups for power and prestige and rank. These are big questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
What drives human behavior drives policy in the end.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so if you have the total displacement.
This chapter gives the documentary intellectual lift. It moves the viewer from one political disappointment to a broader explanation of why systems drift away from their stated ideals. The critique becomes anthropological as much as political. The ending returns to first principles. After belief, identification, defense, and disappointment, the final argument is not that citizens should never trust leaders. It is that trust must remain subordinate to accountability. The office does not demand emotional submission, it demands judgment. And the strongest way to close this story is to return to the line that turns personal frustration into democratic doctrine. The president is not above criticism, because the president is not above the public.
Trump, on the basis of substantive policy decisions that he's made, betrayals that are obvious and quantifiable. And you will get people in your face saying, "How dare you attack the president?" Are you serious? That guy works for me. That guy works for you.
Yeah, listen up, bitch.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
I'm
I
sorry.
agree.
No, your opinion matters. My opinion matters. Every American's opinion matters. We should be heard. We should be respected. And no way am I going to be kowtowed and not saying the obvious, which is this guy has failed in his responsibility. He is disdainful towards the American people. He's disdainful.
The film closes not in cynicism, but in civic recovery. The supporter who once accepted extraordinary risk to defend the project now insists that citizenship requires the right to judge it. That is the final reframe. Accountability is not betrayal of politics, but the condition of responsible politics. The original support was grounded in a coherent message about national restoration, not just attraction to Trump's personality. That support endured because scandal, social pressure, and public hostility were often reinterpreted as proof of commitment rather than evidence of failure. The break came when governing reality contradicted the outsider promise, leading to a final insistence that citizenship requires accountability, not obedience. If political loyalty becomes part of identity, what does it take for a citizen to recover the distance needed to judge power honestly? If this kind of breakdown helps you think differently, you'll probably enjoy the next video too.